Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great week. I'm running into some video problems, so for this one, I'm just going to do an audio recording. I think it's worth going a little deeper and giving some additional commentary to last week's deep dive because the topic of justice is so vast and complex, and it's a delicate issue as well. It's one that I think can fall out of balance a lot more easily than others. And so I think it's more worthwhile to go into that. I'll try and post not necessarily a deep dive, or maybe just an overview of some of the content and key verses that can be found in Doctrine Covenant 67 through 70. So the thing that sparked everything on this was, I, the Lord, will forgive whom I will forgive, but unto you it is required to forgive all men. And if you recall in last week's, we looked at that verse, but also it's pointed out the interesting note that that verse is immediately followed by a lot of scriptures about judgment. And I utilized that as a means of going into Matthew chapter 7, the JST version. And I really like the JST on the Matthew chapter 7 because it clarifies so much. I've gone into the Hebrew, I've gone into the Greek, I've listened to other Christian commentators who all struggle a little bit trying to understand what is meant in Matthew chapter 7, verses, the first verses, which state, "Judge not that ye be not judged, and for what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and what measure ye mete, it shall be measured unto you again." Now, this is a complex verse to process, because if you took it overly literally, and especially out of the context of all other scriptures, and just isolated that and said, this is what the scriptures intend to mean and teach, you would say that we could not make any judgment at all, which is difficult because when you have to define what we mean by judgment, and the word that is used, krino, is a very general term of judgment, right? Even distinguishing between green and yellow and orange is to judge one color to be different from another, or to judge that those differences are meaningful. So every decision, every distinction, every discernment that we make is in fact a form of judgment. Now you could say, well, this is meant to mean don't judge other people, which I think it's a bit of a leap, because that's not what it says in the scriptures, and adding judge not other people that ye be not judged. But I mean, when you get to the next part, for with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. And so obviously, I think there is an extension there to other people that is meaningful, right? How you judge other people will be a reflection of how you will be judged as well. So I do think that there is a little bit of appropriateness to that. However, the most important thing when you're trying to interpret what is meant in Matthew chapter 7 is, how does this fit into the context of all other scriptures? Because there are other scriptures, in particular a verse found in John, that does state that we should judge righteous judgment. And I like that because in the Joseph Smith translation, which we focused on last week, it states, "Judge not unrighteously, that ye be not judged, but judge righteous judgment." And that perfect revelation into that just clears up what it means. And I think if you used common sense in interpreting Matthew chapter 7, you would arrive at something very similar to what the Joseph Smith translation is suggesting, that we need to be judicious with our judgment. We should avoid judging unrighteously. And that would be a great topic of discussion, something that you could hold in a Sunday school lesson, of what qualifies as unrighteous judgment. And that deserves some time and attention. And you can go to some verses in the scriptures in particular that say that judging completely on the outward appearance does seem to be problematic, especially if you consider a lot of the reprimands that came from Jesus Christ, where he stated that he does not like hypocrisy. So again, judging on the appearance can get you going wrong in both directions. One, you may be showing favoritism to people who are hypocrites, who clean the outer vessel, but in the inward vessel, what's the term that it's used in there, that you are something like gilded, whited temples that are full of dead men's bones, right? It's a really harsh image. And then on the flip side of that, there are many people who are righteous, like the widow's mite, who are just casting in a couple mites, but are giving more. And so that's something to be taken account when you're trying to judge righteous judgment. That gets highlighted through a few verses, and there's some stuff in the Old Testament as well about how we ought to not give preference to the outward appearance. So that's an important principle in judging righteous judgment, as well as I think just even taking the next part of Matthew chapter 7, which says, with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged. There's a golden rule to that, which says, how would I prefer people to treat me? Or maybe another variation of that same thought is, if there was a being of ultimate good and love, the highest good and the highest virtue, how would they judge me? So I had a discussion with somebody this week, and we talked about judgment. And this was more in a discussion about some of the psychotherapeutic principles. And in psychotherapy, one of the tools that's used to help people judge and discern in a good way and to balance between mercy and justice is to look at it from a pragmatic perspective. So the instrument that's used in psychotherapy is, you would say, is this true? And then you would ask, is this helpful? Now, a lot of people who suffer from depression and anxiety may have these notions that sound like they're true. They may ask themselves, like, I'm a failure. Is this true? Well, yes, it's true. I am a failure. I've done this wrong. I've done this wrong. I've done this wrong. And then you would ask the next question and say, well, is that statement helpful for you? And they would say no. And then you would look at them and say, well, then it's not true. And this has to do with a deep dive into our definition of what truth is. And we touched on that in the first episode on the spiritual domain, and how, the notion of what true is honestly, it's very rarely, when we look at how we act, it's very rarely defined as something like a scientific truth or materialistic truth. Very rarely are we discussing the actual matter of existence and quantum and quarks and elements and molecules, at that level of that's what reality is. That very rarely enters into our conversations. And so pointing that out, we would say, well, since the majority of the human experience is involved in how to act, how we should act, and our relationships with one another, and there's a tremendous amount of oughts and shoulds involved in all of that discourse, it appears that considering that the fundamental constituents of actual living is the motivational world, the narrative world, and the world of value, how does this pertain to our discussion about truth? And that gets really fascinating, because you'll start to see that this notion that, is it helpful, really slides into a different realm of truth, where you have a material as well as a spiritual domain. And in the spiritual domain, you can ask the question of, is this helpful? And if it's not, then it's not true. And that may actually supersede all materialistic truth, or something that you consider to be more fundamentally and essentially factual. Now, is this helpful? If you wanted to actually extend this even more, you would say, is this helpful for me now? Is this helpful for me today, tomorrow? Is this going to be helpful for me in the long run? Is this going to be helpful for me and my family and all of society? And start to branch out there, and you might be able to ascertain other levels or deeper levels of truth as well. Perhaps you can find things that kind of coalesce to a degree where it may be beneficial for you as well as other people. So, is this helpful? So when we're looking at judgment, the thing that I pointed out was, it's kind of interesting. If I were to put this in a context that's a little bit less from a psychological or psychiatric interventional perspective, I would put this in a scriptural sense and say, well, obviously, the truths that we have of the gospel seem to not be, again, super focused on materialistic truths. we look at virtues such as mercy and justice, compassion, love, and kindness, and wisdom, and faith and hope. We have all of these virtues which reflect truths that seem to be of greater value and importance than sheer materialistic. And this gets very challenging when we're looking at mercy and justice. How do we balance between mercy and justice? That is the question that is at hand, right? Because judging righteous judgment seems to reflect a balance between those two virtues. So how do we, and as you're getting your thoughts going on how you might do that, you could say, is there a deeper truth or a higher virtue that helps balance between those? Now, the answer that I would give on that, if I'm just jumping to this quickly, is I would say that the higher virtue that balances mercy and justice is love. However, that itself can be a little bit shallow because the word love is difficult to define, especially if you're going to say, all right, so in what ways does love balance mercy and justice? And if it's not going to really add a ton of insight, there's a little bit of a mystery on how that may actually come to pass. So I believe it's true. I do believe that the scales of mercy and justice, that it hinges on the virtue of love. But I will go a step further and define it. So in Greek, we have agape, which is defined as, usually we look at that as the pure love of Christ or charity or the highest love. But even then, you may have heard me say this in other times, that if we just substitute love with charity and the pure love of Christ, you're not fully, pure love of Christ does have some sort of a visual to that. And we can look at the sacrifice that Christ made and say that gives us some insight into what pure love may actually be in some sort of pragmatic sense. I'm going to go to the original Hebrew here, though. Ahab is built from H and B, het and bet, hey and bet, sorry. Those are the Hebrew letters in the two-letter root system there. And hey, it means look. It's a man with his hands up and he's saying, look at this. And bet is the tent. So it means to look at the tent or look to the tent. And in the tent, we find the family. And so this is looking at the family. And so the ultimate love, we would say, if we're looking at that, we would say, look at the divine family, our Heavenly Father and His love. So what does this have to do with anything? Is I would say the hinges of the scales of mercy and justice, they are balanced on love, or Ahab, the essential and fundamental narrative that you are a child of God and that God wants to be connected to you. He wants to be one with you. That's what atonement means. He sent His Son, Jesus Christ, to atone, to make you one with Him. So if something is not moving you closer to God, moving you closer and more connected to Him and more one with Him, then that thing is not morally good. It is not morally true in a sense, because it's moving you away from God. And so when you ask that question of, is this true and is this helpful, perhaps the Christian version of that is, does this make you closer to God? This idea, this notion, this statement. And if you filter it and it does not make you closer to God, then it is not true. And you can judge that. Again, this is all about judgment. You can judge that to be an unrighteous judgment. And a just judgment is something that would move an individual. If it's within the domain of the individual, it would be, you would say that it does not move us closer to God. And here is the notion, because we talked and focused on justice. Justice is essential, and the hypothesis is because we've lost touch with this a bit in Western society, and we have lost touch with the idea that actual justice, actual judgment moves people closer to God. So in another conversation, we were talking about elite performers. And if you were to be an elite performer, especially in athletics, you want people to judge you. You pay people to judge you. Your whole life is centered around people telling you what you've done wrong. They analyze and microanalyze every little detail. I remember hearing this in the context of basketball, and coaches were talking about, they were talking in a context of shooting and foot placement. And they would say, your feet need to be angled this direction. They need to be placed this way. You cannot be 1 inch out of line, a couple of degrees off. And they would scrutinize things to that degree. And you'd say, well, man, nobody wants to be scrutinized that way. And yes, there are many, many contexts, take a marriage, for example, where that level of scrutiny is not generally warranted. However, at the professional level, if you are seeking to become the best self in a particular field, you will find that that scrutiny is actually welcomed. And if you thought about that, well, what this is not basketball, or this is not track, or track and field, or some sort of elite performance. What does this have to do with spirituality? And I think so. I want to give one more example before I jump into that, because I'm a track athlete. I love track and field, and I remember going to doing some pace work and training with Olympic gold medalist and silver medalist. And so with the coach there, when he gave us a time to run, he says, I want you guys to run this lap in 64 seconds. And if we ran that lap in 65 seconds, he would throw a fit. He was like, I told you 64 seconds. We are, in a sense, paying you to run this in 64 seconds. If I say 64 seconds, I want it exactly 64 seconds, not 64 and a half seconds. I want it 64 seconds. And that was the level of detail they were looking at. And again, at the elite performance, in a perspective of elite performance, that's the type of judgment that you get. And again, I am not necessarily saying that we need to invite this into every domain of our lives. However, there is a domain. It is the domain of repentance, the sacramental domain, when you partake of the bread and the water, that you should at least invite that in occasionally. That level of analysis of, I want to be better. I want to be connected with God. I want to be one with Him. And there are many things keeping me out of the way. What are all of those things? And invite the feedback. And that doesn't mean you have to do all those things at once and immediately, but it should. I think there is something beneficial. And maybe this is because I, as a man, I might have that affinity towards the masculine. And I have this background with athletics where I am not afraid of that judgment, because I'm not going to let that judgment completely consume me and destroy me and overtake me. That I can stand and look at that in the eye and say, okay, I'm ready to go to work and make things better. And that's an important thing. Not everyone really is at that stage yet. Sometimes people may be in a Job scenario where, before you're out criticizing and giving advice, it says, to him that is afflicted, pity should be shown. And so, yes, there's a time and a season where pity and mercy is the primary thing that's needed. But once you've kind of nurtured someone back to strength, then it's like, it's time to get to work. It's time to get to the weightlifting and the training and improving our capacity. And you could say that that's true even from a injury perspective that's physical, right? If you're going to go through rehab, sometimes you just need 6 months of rest, put no weight on that torn Achilles. But then after that, we're going to slowly start to do some work. And if you are the way that you are governing yourself, or perhaps where the people that you have been called or in your jurisdiction to govern, that might be most relevant to parents. If you have not put into the equation some form of work, the masculine archetype, you could be better. You could be better. If you have not fully integrate that, you're missing out on things. This might be a little bit more overly psychological jargon, but I've kind of sprinted past this before, and maybe one of these days I might give a more replete and comprehensive description of this and how this all came to be. But it begins with the idea that you have order and chaos. Order is associated with father culture, and chaos is associated with mother nature. And as you can see father and mother in there, then they have a masculine, feminine archetype. And one of the things that I've really pondered in a pragmatic sense is how do these archetypes manifest within our psyche and in the most relevant ways of the human experience. And the thesis that I have proposed is that the feminine manifests in this true idea, and it is that you are good enough. You are good just the way you are. And in many sense, that's very true. And we can back that up with scriptures, especially the ones that are centered around compassion and grace, that Christ died for the ungodly. He gave his life for sinners. And there's at no moment that the grace of God and the reach of God, the desire to make you better, is not in full effect. And that you have access to that at any time because of that merciful, beautiful grace that is offered to you. And that would fit more in a traditional, from a psychological perspective, feminine archetype. And in the masculine, it contradicts that. And yet it's still true, and there's space for it, and that is you could be better. Because if you really believe that and you accepted that as truth, that you could be better, then you are contradicting the idea that you are good enough as you are. Because for you to accept the notion that you could be better, it says there's something wrong with the way that you are right now that needs to be changed in order for you to be whole. And yes, that is also true, and they contradict one another. And that's, again, this balance between justice and mercy, balance between order and chaos, the balance between culture and nature and masculine and feminine. That's a very important thing, and that's what we're tapping into, and why you're probably seeing a lot of an extra ramblings and exposition about this topic, because it's so essential in order to really achieve wholeness, perfection, in the sense that perfection is defined as a wholeness and complete state. It will require you to examine both of those statements and achieve some sort of true balance. And I think it's worth, as you're making those judgments, to look at it through both contexts of, where am I at? Am I at a stage where I am just completely broken and I just need pure nurturing love, unconditional, just grace and mercy and compassion to help Job get back on his feet? And then once the person's back on their feet, it's, okay, where does the judgment come? And again, it's very rare that this is what's required of you for other people. That's not always designed, but there are times where maybe you need to stand up for truth and stand up for righteousness. And the example we gave was a Captain Moroni sense. We ran into a example of this that caused a little bit of stir, which is, again, the fact that this caused a stir was a little bit of causing a little bit of an internal stir in myself and my soul, because it's a witness to why what we're missing in Western civilization, where what caused the stir was a Jeffrey R. Holland quote where we needed to be more willing to stand up for our doctrines. And, he gave I think, something analogy of muskets. And, in a sense that, again, this has to do with this judgment and archetype thing where, yes, a righteous judgment does include standing for truth. It's standing for virtue and standing for what is right. And that's going to be difficult. It's going to put pressure on you. It's going to make you more like the Captain Moroni figure, who it's going to be risky to do that. So on that topic, I can't remember if I mentioned that last week, but in a criticism against Christianity, the philosopher Nietzsche, which I don't accept everything he says at wholesale, but it's very interesting and intriguing that in his critique, he said that a lot of people hide cowardice behind mercy and grace, where instead of being willing to put their morals to the test and stand up for truth, they just kind of wipe everything clean with grace and mercy. And they're not doing it because they're actually merciful and graceful. They're doing it because they're too weak to stand up for themselves. And you run into this all the time in psychology with doormats, people who are overly agreeable, who are unwilling to stand up for their own internal virtue. They create dissonance within themselves. They act inauthentically by not standing up for truth. And standing up for truth is the essence of justice and judgment, and that is good. It is appropriate. There is a time and a season for that, and there is a time and a season to meet people halfway. So it's kind of funny. You would have thought that this would have landed more on mercy, because the stemming the verse that stemmed all of this was, I the Lord will forgive whom I will forgive, but to you is required to forgive all men, which is a very, very merciful statement. And I do believe in mercy, and mercy is a virtue and a judge and something that is absolutely necessary and holy and sacred. And if you usually ask me on a given day what would I prefer, is I would prefer a little bit of mercy. But do not deny justice, because Western society is letting that slip. It's letting virtue, the Moroni-like virtue, slip from us. I wanted to bring that to your attention, and maybe the thing you could ask yourself is, how can I integrate the voice of justice and the virtue of justice better into my life to be able to achieve a more perfect balance between mercy and justice. So, few thoughts on that. I could go and ramble more and more, but I think that's a good starting point, and I hope this has helped you, and I hope you have a great rest of the week. I will do my best to post some sort of content overview of 67 through 70. Otherwise, you guys have a great week, and God bless. Bye.